Good evening, YouTube audience. Glad to see you here on this awesome Tuesday, November 2nd, 2020. First, get rid of that echo. There we go. Glad to see you on this Tuesday, November 1st, 2022, heading into Wednesday, November 2nd, 2022. Glad to see you on my 22nd. A lot of twos happening here. Glad to see you on my 22nd YouTube Live. I have a lot to talk about. I look forward. Please, if this is the first time you're watching this, don't hesitate to like, share, and subscribe. Don't hesitate to subscribe. Don't hesitate to like. Don't hesitate to comment. Haven't really gotten an engaged comment yet. I've been done 22 YouTube Lives. If you're watching, just say hi or just talk about what I'm talking about or add a helpful comment or just say something. Um, if it's kind of ignorant, I don't think I'll read it, but I'm just glad to be here. I'm glad to provide information to raise the vibration. I think that might be the next slogan of all my future YouTube lives, including this one: information to raise the vibration. I'm glad to see you here. I wanted to shout out to Dash Hudson for a recent awesome YouTube live conversation we had on his IG. And as you can see, his handle is Dash Hudson underscore. And before I even joined this live, and we engaged in an awesome, almost 2 hour conversation just about consciousness and parenting and eliminating shadows and how, as parents, being a conscious, in my opinion, the whole talk Dash and I had on his IG live last week was about conscious parenting for me and being aware of oneself. Um, we discussed a range of topics. So if you go to his IG, um, I believe it was last week, Thursday, we had this awesome conversation. His IG handle is Dash Hudson underscore. We talked about so much. It was so encouraging. Um, Parenting, I shared my information about my upcoming third book, which is a collection of responses. And yeah, the whole book is a response to the scholarship of Dr. Tony Martin, who is the editor of the Marcus Garvey Library and the most prolific author of the works of Marcus Garvey. So I was able to talk about that on Dash Hudson's IG Live. I was able to talk about uh, being aware of oneself and how to find a partner who is aware, who is on that journey as you of self awareness, who is seeking self awareness, and what that looks like. So check out Dash Hudson's IG Live. We had an awesome conversation, and I thank Dash for inviting me on his IG Live last week. You can see it at Dash Hudson underscore DASHHUDSON underscore. I also had the awesome opportunity to present at the Caribbean Philosophical Association conference in Lansing, Michigan, at Michigan State University this past Saturday. I was along two awesome colleagues. I presented my research on Tony Martin, which will culminate in a book scheduled to be released in 2023. I had the opportunity to speak publicly for the first time in so many years because of the pandemic. We had to mask up, we had to be quarantined, we had to rely more on Zoom conferences. But this was the first time I was able to travel and begin again the practice of presenting in person, which is always an amazing experience. Before I presented my work on Tony Martin, I attended a panel the day before on Friday, October 28th, about the Haitian Revolution. And it was awesome to hear and to be in the room with scholars who've studied and who are reading their work about their selected field. So it was an amazing time. One particular aspect of my research on Tony Martin spoke out hours before and during the presentation. And that aspect is the theoretical approach that writers, scholars take to studying people's work. And I talked about specifically Tony Martin's edited collection of Eric Williams's presentation in a small pamphlet called The Economic Future of the Caribbean. And I used Mario Acevedo, who describes two different theories, two different theoretical approach to African history or history of the continent of Africa. And this is also related to the book I just read. And I think Piero Gleijeses takes a developmental formula approach. Mario Acevedo basically says when you or writers or scholars, academics in this part of the world in the West write about Africa, they use one of two approaches. They either use the Washingtonian formula, as Acevedo writes, and or they use the developmental formula, which is the formula to asks basically what do the people on the continent of Africa want in terms of their own development. And when we think about those two theories, it's clear that the founder of the Department of African Studies at Howard, who is William Leo Hansberry, advocated for more of the developmental formula. Whereas the way Tony Martin writes about Eric Williams, what I write in my work on Eric Williams is that you can't help but conclude that Tony Martin is basically saying Eric Williams follows the Washingtonian formula, which is whatever the Washington US government wants. And that's a big theme in this particular book. Gleijeses writes about the US trying to impose its Washington formula on the country of Angola. But it comes up against Castro's army, who is really fighting for the developmental formula, who is really fighting for the freedom of Angola from dictatorial rule, from military, basically, occupation. And so Gleijeses details that thoroughly in this book, which I highly recommend. But I find it interesting that of all the parts that I chose to read from my manuscript at this conference, I chose to read that part, that description of the theoretical approach, whether historians we read, people who are writing about Africa that we read, whether they're taking a Washington formulaic approach where they simply dress it up as a pig, but it's basically a pig and it's basically at its root what Washington wants, what private interest based US multinational private interests want to do in Africa, like Bill Gates, those interests, what they want to do in Africa, which is usually at odds with what the people on the continent in the area want for themselves. And so we see those two differing approaches. Tony Martin, it's my belief that Tony Martin takes a more developmental approach because of his Pan-Africanist focus and his um, self-declaration as a Pan-Africanist, whereas the traditional academics in the West, they take more of a Washingtonian approach, where they do what Washington wants. So shout out to Tony Martin. Shout out to also the conveners of this amazing conference. Aneta Bete Congolo of the University of Maine invited me along. It was awesome to also see a former colleague that I read and that I was at Temple University with, Dr. Lewis Gordon. His wife, Dr. Anna Gordon, chaired the panel that I was on. And I want to thank my fellow panelists, Jim Vernon from York University in Toronto, all power to the people. He did an awesome presentation on Huey Newton. And I want to thank also Jesse Oslavsky, who presented an awesome paper about, as you can see here in this image, imagining a second abolition, Pan-African writers and the abolitionist tradition. He also had copies. Absolutely. And it's right here. And I was so grateful. He had given away copies. Jesse had given away copies of his book. He was so gracious. And I noticed when I turned the page, he had as the epigraph of his introduction a quote by none other than Russell Maroon Schultz, talking about the value of the Underground Railroad. He begins the first page giving an anecdote of William Still helping three fugitives in Philadelphia. And he begins the whole chapter with a quote from Russell Maroon Schultz about the Underground Railroad. So it was an awesome experience. So glad to be back. Congratulations to the Caribbean Philosophical Association. I also saw Page Henry, an incredible scholar, theoretician of the Caribbean. Congratulations on a successful conference that took place. If you just joined, This is my 22nd YouTube live. Welcome. Please subscribe, like, and share my YouTube. Subscribe to my channel, like the videos, and share. Please tell your friends if you've got information out of this that you could use. Don't hesitate to support my Cash App, which is $Ron Fraser, $Ron Fraser. Seeing a lot in the news about Kanye, and particularly um, the responses, it makes me think of Aretha Franklin's interview with the Wall Street Journal when the interviewer, whose name I forget, but I knew he worked for the Wall Street Journal. It's the interview where she says about Taylor Swift gowns, nice gowns, and people laugh at that, as Aretha kind of covering to avoid whether she likes how certain artists sing. But the gem for me in that whole interview was when the interview asked her, Aretha, what's the holdup with the film, was his question. And she made clear in a very sophisticated, dignified, profound way that there is no holdup with the film. And with everything that's happened to Kanye, I really, despite, I think personally, as a journalist, as a writer, as a scholar, as a blogger, that what has happened to him is absolutely unfair. But what I will not do as a responsible scholar, as a responsible blogger, as a responsible original content creator, I will not participate in ridiculing, turning into a spectacle the loss of his money. And like Miss Franklin, I will celebrate instead the increase. This is not a loss for him, but an increase. This is absolutely, in what I see, a development of his character. Because in everything that he said, I may not agree with everything Candace Owens says from a conservative blogger standpoint, but I do agree with her interpretation of the so-called controversial tweet by Kanye that said he's going to go DEFCON. As Candace Owens said, that is a defensive posture. I did not hear not one insult to any cultural group in what Kanye said. I heard no insult. He was taking a simply defensive posture. He was identifying the heritage, as we all do, among Rastas, among Muslims, among Christians, among Jews, among Jewish, among Orthodox Christians. All he was doing was identifying a specific heritage. And he said nothing offensive. So I, frankly, as a US citizen, think it's unfair that he's expressing his constitutional right for free speech and losing so much money as a result. But I do want to focus on his increase. I do want to focus on his increase, which is why I have this image up. I don't agree with the way Jason Lee, the way Tariq Nasheed, when I was in Michigan, I heard Tariq Nasheed talking about all this money Kanye lost and how he lost this and he lost that. And hear Jason Lee talking about they're going to close his school. And then I went to the website and I realized they're going to reopen in 2023. So, like Miss Franklin, I am thinking there is no holdup. There are no obstacles. We're seeing and we're believing increase. We're manifesting increase. We don't manifest loss, we manifest increase. And then I see Mark Lamont Hill talking about he was not allowed or he was escorted out of some office. I don't see rejection. I don't see what these bloggers, Jason Lee, Mark Lamont Hill, and Tariq Nasheed, are trying to see. They're joining in the chorus to create this false sense of reality. I see increase. I see an absolute development. I see gains in Kanye. I see increase. I see growth. I see absolute astronomical development. I'm proud that he stood up for what he believed and did not back down and did not apologize to the people that the bigwigs wanted him to apologize to. He apologized to the Black community because he understood that that video footage of George Floyd having some officer on his neck was really a symbol for all Black people. So if he seemed insensitive to Black people, not to billionaires, but to Black people, he apologizes for that. So I appreciate that. And that's why I have this, because as I mentioned in my IG video about the Woman King, there's not just one game in town. There is more than one way to skin a cat. This headline from Etan Blessing from The Hollywood Reporter says Kanye Ye West to buy conservative social media platform Parler. Parliament Technology said it has struck an agreement in principle with the rapper turned fashion giant after rival social media sites restricted his access over comments. And I loved how this subheadline reads over comments deemed racist or hate speech, deemed, not is, but deemed, because absolutely, in my mind, there's nothing racist about what Kanye said. There's nothing hateful. He was pointing out a reality. And unfortunately, um, lost, chose to have people who saw him say his truth chose to not do business with him. But they're not the only people in the world that he could do business with. Parler is one of those groups he could do business with. This past Sunday, I had the incredible pleasure to meet the legendary Melba Moore. I first heard Melba Moore on a CD that I have that was the original Broadway cast soundtrack to Pearly, the musical, the 1974 musical, I believe, um, that starred her and Cleavon Little. It was based on the film Pearly Victorious, written by Ossie Davis. And so she performed in this amazing musical I saw within about 5 miles from where I live at the Arc Theater in DC here, Southeast DC. This musical is written by Dr. Daniel Spruill. It's called Roll On. I love the message. She was a phenomenal character and a very interesting story. The story was of a young boy who is learning himself, trying to grow up, leave town. He finds out soon enough that his pastor and not the man who raised him is his biological father. Melba Moore plays his biological mother. And if you go to my IG Live, you'll hear that awesome song she's singing right across the pastor. And she definitely plays a conflicted character. And what astounds me about Melba Moore is that she hit that high note and held it so long. And her voice is as strong as it was when I first heard it on that early original Broadway cast soundtrack. So thank you, thank you, Ms. Moore, for your generosity, for your kindness, for seeing me. This is me and Ms. Moore right outside the theater, the Arc Theater in Southeast DC. And I'm so grateful she took the time to hug me. And I was able to tell her what she meant to me, what her music meant to me. One of the most endearing conversations I ever had in this entire city in my entire life was with a DC resident and this DC resident schooled me on the beauty of the song by Melba Moore, The Other Side of the Rainbow. And wow, I heard that song, and yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. I thank her name is Sherry. Sherry is the DC resident who schooled me on that song and what that song meant to her and meant to so many people, um, and the meaning of that song, The Other Side of the Rainbow. So thank you, Ms. Moore, for your beautiful music. I also have a very fond memory of Melba Moore on The Cosby Show when she played Rudy's teacher. And I remember in that episode, Cliff, Rudy's father, um, when Melba Moore's character wasn't in the room, moves Rudy's poster from the bottom to the top. And Melba Moore's very last line in the scene with Bill Cosby is, "I noticed you moved uh, even though she wasn't in the room when he did it, Rudy's poster from the bottom to the top. But she did it in such class. Yeah, awesome actress. I appreciate your work, Ms. Moore. And she generously responded to me on Instagram and corrected a few details that was in her Wikipedia that I sent her. Very gracious, very inspiring. And her birthday was the 2 days before the show I saw, the 29th of October. Um, and and she's in her 70s and still sounds amazing. She still sounds amazing. The music was awesome. The experience was great. Thank you, Dr. Spruill, for an amazing gospel musical in Roll On. And thank you, Ms. Melba Moore, for unforgettable performance. For an unforgettable performance. It's most appreciated. Finally, today I finished a book I always wanted to finish. I was telling my friend Jasmine that my friend Jasmine gave me the book Homegoing by Ya Gyasi, and I told Jasmine before I start Homecoming, I want to finish this book on my shelf, and the book's name is Visions of Freedom. Well, after how many months, I was finally able to finish it today, Tuesday, November 1st, 2022, and I'm grateful to have finished it. This is also related to the theory that Mario Acevedo pointed out in his book Africana Studies about the Washingtonian formula versus the developmental formula. It's clear the tone, the theoretical approach of Gleijeses is that of the developmental formula. I believe deep in my heart, based on how Gleijeses writes this 530-page tome, 530-page um, chronicle of the war in Angola between the U.S. and Cuba, um, it's clear that Gleijeses takes a developmental approach. And I just want to share a few pages from you from this book and want to show you one page in particular. I'm just going to read parts out loud and provide context for each part. So there were groups in Angola, the nation in Southwest Africa. The U.S. supported UNITA, National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, as well as South Africa. Um, and it was that organization that was fighting against the rival organization, the MPLA, which Cuban forces supported, um, and which the president of Angola was part of and was trying to use that organization to exclude Savimbi, Jonas Savimbi, who was basically the US and South African puppet put into Angola. But I wanted to share particular parts of this amazing um, text. Page one, well, this is my personal notes from page 30. This narrative provides a beginning blueprint for what fighting to make Africa for the Africans looks like. And that's a phrase from Garvey, Africa for the Africans. For Cuba to choose to send troops to depose, to expel brutal dictators is absolutely an example of making sure Africa is for the Africans. On page 163, I took some notes. These are notable parts in the whole biography. The minutes of the February 23rd, 1973 National Security Meeting and Brzezinski's March 3rd, 1978 memo to Carter indicate that the Carter administration was funneling covert aid to Savimbi, which Reagan would continue in the 80s until they couldn't because the military power of the Cubans was too much. On page 189, President Dos Santos had asked African countries to send troops to Angola as a gesture of solidarity against South African aggression, because South Africans were, through Namibia, sending troops to try to install, with US support, Jonas Savimbi. No one agreed, not even Nigeria, not even Algeria. Gleijeses writes, the only country willing to send troops to Angola was Cuba. And that reminds me of Mandela's statement that when Africa called, Cuba answered. On page 228, Gleijeses writes, more than 700 Cubans have given their lives for Angola. That's a quote from Castro. On page 298, what mattered to Savimbi's champions, thousands of Cuban soldiers were in Angola, and Savimbi promised to defeat them. But as Gleijeses writes, they were not able to. He would later pass in the year 2002, Gleijeses writes, um, not being able to um, completely control Angola because of Cuban troop presence. On page 404, Cubans and Soviets were moving in opposite directions, Gleijeses writes. Neocolonialism is worse than colonialism, is something that Gleijeses wrote. And this is what lets me know that in fact Gleijeses is theoretically taking a developmental approach instead of a Washingtonian approach to describing the history and current events in Africa. On page 430, Gleijeses quotes Castro: "The strategic objective of this war is to free Angola from the South African occupation. If we have to fight," Castro said, "we will be stronger than ever." And this is the month that Castro passed away, I believe, a few years back, and he's born August 14th. And what a life Castro lived. He said, "History will absolve me," and he did not lie. On page 480 of Gleijeses' books, uh, on August 30th, he writes, "The last South Africans left Angola." Um, and now this is I wanted to read particularly from the book. This is page 500. I want to see if I can expand it. Can I zoom in? This is a particular quote. Yes. Why less than a month later did Pretoria decide to withdraw unilaterally from Angola? Um, Gleijeses writes, "The answer is abundantly clear in the US and South African archives. It was Cuban military might. It was Cuban military might. It was Cuban military might was the reason that South Africa decided to uh, withdraw its troops from Angola." And in the events that happened after, on page 500, Gleijeses writes, "The MPLA won 53.74 of the votes in the legislature." This was when Savimbi was trying to be reelected. He failed. He was seeking the support from the US and the UN to declare the elections results fraudulent. They would not support him. And so what Gleijeses writes on 502 is the US had no use for Savimbi, and it condemned his refusal to accept his refusal to accept the electoral results. Finally, on 526, and I mentioned this in a recent Facebook Live video I did, um, even though Gleijeses writes that Pretoria decided to withdraw because of the Cuban military might, he asks what I think is a rhetorical question or unnecessary question, um, when he asks, or he says something rather that I think is not true. After all the research he did, what he says, what Gleijeses writes on page 526 is that Cuba drew no tangible benefits from its presence in Angola. And I just didn't agree with that based on all the research. And I remember being in the room with Piero Gleijeses about a few years back when he came to an event. Um, it was hosted by the Foro de Sao Paulo. And I was so glad to see. I remember asking my colleague Josh, who brought his own copy of Gleijeses' book to the event. And I said, "Who is Gleijeses?" And Josh schooled me on who he is on the awesome 2 volume. Not only Josh, but Gordon Barnes schooled me on the valuable work. And I was like, "Are you serious?" And then I, just chose to study him for myself. So thank you, Piero Gleijeses, for documenting the Cuban victory in Angola. It's such an important example when we talk about what Africa for the Africans means. What Castro did in Angola answers that clearly. It is to kick out Nazi supporting dictators who are supported by Nazis, who have an agenda that is connected to um, the overall Nazi agenda for domination. And Castro was able to defend um, our African nation against that encroachment. Um, so what an incredible service he's provided. What an incredible service he's provided. Check out this amazing book, Visions of Freedom, Havana, Washington, Pretoria, and the Struggle for Southern Africa. If you like this Cash App, don't hesitate to support me on $ Rome Fraser, RHONEFRASER. And please like, subscribe, subscribe to my YouTube, like, and share. Happy reading. Thank you for joining me on my 22nd YouTube Live.